This is still relevant today. I'm looking at page, for those of you, I don't know if any of you are following along in the book, but Afghanistan. A communistic government temporarily took over in Afghanistan. Keep in mind, Afghanistan is a Muslim country, and the Muslims generally don't side with the communists. But a communistic government took over. It was a very shaky government, and it was afraid of being toppled. So in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this brought about an end to detente. President Jimmy Carter was very upset, and he said, okay, we were going to play the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980, but we're going to hold our own Olympic Games somewhere else, and we're not going to, because the Olympic Games will pump millions of dollars into the Soviet economy, which Jimmy Carter refused to participate in. Now, the Afghan war was destined to last 8 years. It was similar to Vietnam. I mean, Afghanistan was to Russia, or to not, I mean, Afghanistan was the Soviet Union, what Vietnam was the United States, except the Afghan war brought down the Soviet Union. The Soviet economy simply could not support the Afghan war. The Afghan war, I mean, we would talk about it some when I was in the National Guard. I mean, I joined the National Guard that same year in 1979. And from time to time we'd talk about it. The Afghan war was brutal. No prisoners were taken. Everybody on both sides who surrendered was executed, killed. It brought about some very serious weaknesses, though, in the Soviet military. And it ended with a defeat for the Soviet Union. Even though the communist government that the Soviet Union tried to set up was ousted. Now, this is important because you may all know, hopefully you all know, the United States is still involved in Afghanistan. Afghanistan became a refuge for terrorists, and they were accused of hiding Osama bin Laden. We later found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, just across the border from Afghanistan. And I do not know if Pakistan was deliberately hiding him or not. I don't know how true it is, but I've heard that our satellites could actually see when Osama bin Laden would step out of the house he was hiding in, and could see him coming out and recognize him even from 100 miles up. Again, I don't know how true that is, but that story was told. And that we knew for a long time he was there, so we began to train our men, our SEALs, to go in and take him out. So we built a house that was similar to the one that he lived in. We just room for room, as best we understood it. We built a house like his and trained our troops. Now, you know, you'll find that this room and this room joins with that one. And there's this room and there's a stairway here, so that when our SEALs went into the house where he was staying, they would know their way around and not get lost in the maze. And then when the time came, we went in and took out Osama bin Laden. One of the reasons the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan was a lot of their republics. I mean, they had 16 republics at the time, one of them named Georgia, but a lot of their republics were primarily Muslim. And they were afraid that the Muslim influence would creep into their country. And in fact, I have heard that at the moment, 2014, half of the Russian army is Muslim. And they are fearful that a Muslim insurgency could spread into their country, and they fear Muslim terrorism as much as we do. India, China, the United States, and Russia have all been hit by Muslim terrorism in the last few years. And again, so they did not really want the oil in the Middle East, and especially since Afghanistan had none, they were just trying to keep down Islamic insurgency. The United States was suffering what we call the Vietnam syndrome, and I won't write it down, but Vietnam syndrome is where that we said we're not going to get involved in another Vietnam. And we didn't for several years. But then we wound up getting involved in Afghanistan and in Iraq because it seemed like we were forced to do so. President Ronald Reagan, our next president, I mean, after Nixon, there was Ford and Carter. Johnson, Nixon, I'll tell you what I'm going to do so you can see here. Ford, Carter is still alive. These others are all deceased. But Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union that evil empire. And he began a massive arms race that the Soviet Union tried to match. You know, as Ronald Reagan built up, I was, like I say, I joined the Guard in 1979, and the Guard did little under Jimmy Carter. Then in 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. He began to order that the Guard units train harder. We started training harder. We got better equipment, newer equipment, I mean, even in the Guard. And we built up our armament. And yes, working in Lockheed as I did, Lockheed prospered under Ronald Reagan because Ronald Reagan built up the weapons. The Soviet Union tried to match the weapons build-up, but they simply could not afford to. And by 1990, the Soviet Union simply collapsed under the weight of its own excesses. Among other things, Ronald Reagan had built what's called a nuclear-tipped cruise missile that could fly really, really low. And if you know anything about radar, radar only spots planes that are so high. The lower the plane is, the more difficult it is for radar to spot it. And this has made news recently in the missing airplane, because we're saying if the airplane flew really, really low, radar would have missed it. Again, we don't know what happened to that airplane, but that's still true. Also, Ronald Reagan tried to convince the country to put a whole bunch of nuclear warhead satellites in orbit in a project called Star Wars. Now, the Star Wars would have been extremely expensive, and with all due respect to Ronald Reagan, if it had been built, all of the missiles would by now be obsolete. And if you know anything about keeping anything in orbit, to stay in orbit, it's going to be moving at 5 miles a second. Well, what if the Soviet Union were to attack us, and the missile that we wanted to catch it was somewhere out of position? Or these missiles have to move at 5 miles a second. But what if there wasn't one in position, and some of us felt like that the missiles would be better off if they were on the ground, ready to fire, or in nuclear subs where they could be fired from nuclear submarines or fired from ships. But that space was not the place to put nuclear equipment. So Star Wars, you might say, never did get off the ground. But it's supposed he was designed to put a space shield. Now, folks, I get a laugh when I say this. You can go ahead and laugh if you want to. I have read conspiracy books that says that the real reason for Star Wars was to protect the Earth in case some alien from another star system invaded Earth, some alien invasion. All right. Again, Star Wars, like I say, never got off the ground, but at least we'd have our missiles in orbit to where they could supposedly have a chance to fight against an incoming alien invasion. What's that?
So there are aliens.
They already are here, you said?
So there are aliens.
Again, we don't know that. And again, this is just simply a few people doing some mystical thinking. You know, well, are there aliens? If they are, would they? Anyway, just Just something I always throw in at this time. Now, I'll talk in more detail about the Nixon and Reagan administrations and these presidents later, but one thing your book mentions now, so I'll mention it. Ronald Reagan went through one big scandal in his administration called the Iran-Contra affair. All right, basically it's this. In Iran, the United States had promised never to send any supplies of armaments to Iran, to never send replacement parts to fix up the equipment that might break down for the Iranians, because the Iranians were using our weaponry. We had been their friend at one time. The Contras were a group in South America who were fighting the communists. And it was found that some people in the United States were secretly aiding both Iran and the Contras. Iran was involved in a big war with Iraq, and we wanted to see Iraq lose. Now, when the Iran-Iraq war broke out in 1979, Henry Kissinger said, too bad only one side can lose. Well, he was slightly wrong. The fact is both sides lost. The war dragged on and on and on and on for 8 years, and finally both sides got so tired of fighting that they quit fighting. But it's known that Iran was able to survive as long as it did because it got some help from the United States. Now, the big issue where Ronald Reagan got involved was, did he know about the secret aid to the Contras, which was illegal, or did he not? Congress spent millions of dollars investigating, and in the end, they never did prove that Ronald Reagan knew or did not know. Reagan was said to have been really scared because he recalled too well that President Nixon was forced to resign as a result of a scandal over for who knew what and when did they know it. Every president since Nixon has feared a Watergate type affair. But anyway, Ronald Reagan was able to survive Iran and Contra. And as for the two men who were said to be ringleaders, Oliver North and Admiral Poindexter, they eventually got off the hook. The fact is, Iran-Contra is a scandal that's forgotten about. Nothing came of it. The New World Order, basically, when Brezhnev eventually died, well, there were a couple of other men who reigned in Russia for a few, but finally the Soviet Union got a young man. The men who had led the Soviet Union had been old men. They finally got a young man, 56 years old, but young by their standards, Gorbachev. And Gorbachev tried hard to reform the Soviet Union and appease the West. But under him, the Soviet Union splintered and broke up into pieces. The Cold War was over. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because in the last 2 years, it appears like the Cold War has begun again. But your book talks about the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended for about 23 years, folks. And then may have resumed. The conflict, and here's where your book leaves it. It says the conflict between the United States and Russia was over, and the world began to pay attention to other issues like global warming, the gap between the rich and the poor. Again, this book was written before the present crisis in Russia.